So for the kids portion of the service today, we're going to talk about just a little part of Abraham's story, because it was a little verse that I hadn't noticed before that was really important to me when I first moved to Milton. So I thought I knew Abraham's story well. I had read it many times and I had learned it as a child. But there's this one verse that I hadn't noticed and wasn't important to me until I moved to Milton. So I'm just going to explain a little about my story of moving to Milton and how it connects with Abraham's story. So I moved to Milton almost 12 years ago now. And I came to Milton because I felt God speak to me and tell me to come to Milton. I just heard the word Milton and I just knew in my heart that it was because I was supposed to live here. So that's kind of similar to Abraham being called to the promised land. God spoke to him and said, I want you to move to Canaan, or the promised land. Now, I want to be careful about comparing myself to Abraham, because let's be honest, my journey to Milton was a whole lot easier than his journey to Canaan. So I'm going to tell you a little about his journey and mine, and you're going to see that I have nothing to complain about. He had quite the journey. So he actually started off in this little place called all right? And that is where he lived with his family. And it was actually his father who first had the idea of moving to Canaan. So this is and this over here is Canaan. All right, so Abraham's father took his sons and their families, and they all set out on a trip to Canaan to move there. So what they did is they traveled up here and they stopped in Haran. Now I'm sure that there are some smart kids out there who are looking at this map and saying, they're not going the right way, right? You see and you see Canaan and you're like, why are you going up? Why don't you go just straight across? Wouldn't that be shorter? And you might be right, except that you need to know that in this space in between is a desert. And it's really hard to live or travel through a desert, especially at that time. They would have a hard time finding any water or food to help them get through the journey. There wouldn't be any landmarks to be able to know where they're going. So what they did is they actually followed the water. So right here is the river Euphrates, okay? So they traveled along the river and they got to Haran. And by that point in time, it had been a really long journey. So they stopped and they stayed there for a while. And actually, while they stayed there, Abraham's father died. So after Abraham's father died, God spoke to Abraham and said, I have this land that I am promising to you. I want you to pack up your family and you're going to travel to Canaan. So he went the rest of the way. So he was in Haran and now traveling along the water again, this time along the Mediterranean Sea, over down to Canaan. So I figured that I would take a look on Google and find out how long it would have taken him to travel, because Google knows everything, right? But I couldn't find anyone who had done the math to figure out how long it would be. So what I do know is they said it's more than 500 miles from Haran down to Canaan. And so then I looked up how far people could walk in a day, because that's really probably how Abraham got there, was just by walking. Can you imagine? And so there's people that thought maybe he would travel about 10 to 20 miles a day if it was a good walking day. So my guess is it might have taken a month or more for them to walk from Haran to Canaan. That is a crazy trip. So to compare my story, to move to Milton, I packed up my car and a truck. I drove like 2.5 hours. I got here, I had an apartment all ready for me, and I just unpacked. I can go back to visit my family whenever I want. So different. Because once Abraham left where he came from, there was no going back. And when he got there, he didn't know where he was going to live. He didn't know where he was going to set up his tent. He actually had to move a few times once he got there. So it's a very different thing. It was a very difficult journey that he went on. So, just to compare now, going back to my story of coming to Milton. So because I felt like God spoke to me and that I was coming to Milton because I was following him, I thought for sure that things would go really well. And not only because I was following God and like being faithful to him, but also because 2 months before I arrived in Milton, there was just a cool weekend. There was a lot of God moments, and it just seemed like everything was working together. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that weekend. So it was 2 months before I arrived in Milton to stay. I came to visit, and I was coming to drop off resumes for jobs. I was putting up advertising for the music lessons I was hoping to teach once I moved here, and I checked out a church. And 3 things happened on that weekend that was just got me so excited about moving here. So one thing that happened was that I had been applying for a bunch of different jobs and hadn't heard anything. But when I dropped off a resume that weekend, they offered me an interview on the spot that I could go to the next day. So that was super exciting after being so frustrated with the job prospects. The second thing that happened, I wasn't even planning to look for an apartment when I was there that weekend. But at one of the places where I put up my poster advertising music lessons, there was a little piece of paper advertising a 2-bedroom basement apartment that was available for rent. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. So I called them up and they're like, we'll be here for another half an hour if you can come by. So I went by and looked at it, and it was bigger than what I was expecting, but still within my price range. And the family was fine with me teaching music lessons there, which is amazing. I wasn't expecting that to be so easy. And then also, like, this is middle of June, and I'm planning on moving here in middle of August. So they were willing to just let the apartment sit empty for 2 months for me to be able to move in. So that was really amazing just to see that happen. And then the third thing that happened that weekend that I was just so excited about what God was doing was that when I went to check out the church, I was introduced to someone who I thought would be a really great connection for me socially once I got here, and also a really good connection career-wise. So it just seemed like that was a God thing that person was brought into my life. So I went home and I wrote up a note and I called it God is Good Part 1. And I told my friends about all these things that had happened, and I specifically called it Part 1 because I assumed that once I moved here, I'd have more of these amazing opportunities. And I would be writing Part 2 and Part 3 and Part 4, and I was so excited. Well, little spoiler alert, Part 2 never got written. And that's not because God isn't good, but it's because things didn't work out the way I expected. So once I moved to Milton, things were hard. They were really tough. So I moved here, I had a really hard time finding work. I ran out of money, and I think I was the loneliest that I've ever been in my life. And I was just so confused because I was like, God, I'm here because you called me here. What are you up to? So there was a lot of times of me like crying to God and saying, what's going on? I don't understand. Why am I here? Why aren't things working out the way that I expected? And I see better now kind of how God was at work, but at the time, the answer that he gave to me was to draw my attention to Abraham's story. And remember, I talked about the one verse. So I had one verse that kind of stood out to me that was really important. So I'm going to summarize what has happened so far. So the journey that we talked about with Abraham has happened. So he has traveled from Haran down to Canaan. When he was in Shechem, God then spoke to him there and was saying, this land you are on is going to be given to your offspring. So like, your great-great-great-grandchildren are going to like own this land. And so he was like confirming to him that yes, you are where you're supposed to be. And Abraham got there. And then this is the verse. So this is Genesis 12, verse 10. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. Now it doesn't tell us what Abraham was thinking. But if I were him, I think I would be a little frustrated. You've spent all this time traveling to the place that God said, this is where you're supposed to be. And then there wasn't enough food to be able to support the people, so they had to go somewhere else. And so like that verse kind of stood out to me because Abraham was following God. He was doing what God asked him to, but things didn't work out the way we would expect. And so that was just a good reminder to me at the time that, okay, I don't get you, God. It doesn't make sense, but you've done this in the past. You're doing it again. I'm going to trust you in this time. And it all became a little bit clearer a few years later because I started a group called Connect with some of my friends. And basically Connect is a social group for people who are lonely to find friends. And honestly, if I hadn't had that time of being really lonely when I first moved to Milton, I never would have understood the need for a group like Connect. So even though it was really hard and I struggled so much when I first got here, I see now that God was at work even then. And so I just want to encourage you that if following God doesn't work out how like you expect, so maybe you've chosen to do the right thing and people make fun of you for it, or something else where you're just like, it is so hard to follow God. I want to encourage you that even if it is tough, that God is still at work. He is still good, and He is still doing things. We don't always understand what or why He's working the way He is, but we can trust Him to be good and to be faithful to us. And so we just need to continue trusting in Him and following His